And I just want to encourage everyone to be safe, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, and thank the protesters for their commitment to safely protest during this pandemic. To all of those of you who are in pain, to those who are angry, to those who are afraid, I not only see you, I hear you, and I stand with you. We will get answers. We will seek justice. George Floyd didn't deserve to die, but George Floyd does deserve justice. Now, as many of you know, out of abundance of caution, Lieutenant Governor and I have not been at events together for the past 3 months. Avoiding the chance of both of us being exposed to COVID-19 has meant that the Lieutenant Governor is working remotely with us every day. But before I turn it over to her, I think for many of you who know the Lieutenant Governor's work of decades of working on equity and justice issues, she's an important voice for all of us, and I'm just proud that she is helping us work through this tragic situation, trying to make sure that we do everything in our power to make sure that that fair, thorough, and fast investigation is done to move this process of justice forward. And with that, I would turn it over to Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan.
Thank you so much, Governor. I'm grateful to be able to join you in this way today. My deepest sympathies to all of George Floyd's family and friends. I'm so deeply sorry for your loss. My heart breaks for Minneapolis, for St. Louis Park, the community that I call home and that George Floyd called home, and for Minnesota. I'm also outraged that Minnesotans, especially Black Minnesotans and Black Americans, are experiencing the collective trauma of a Black man dying at the hands of law enforcement once again. George Floyd should be alive today. We are pursuing answers through state and federal investigations, but one thing is very clear to me. The complete lack of humanity in the video of George's death is horrifying. We will get answers and we will seek justice. It goes without saying that no one should be treated differently by law enforcement due to the color of their skin, and no one should live in fear of law enforcement because of the color of their skin. The grief in this moment is unbearable. But in this moment of pandemic, it's more than that. Because the truth is that the same underlying issues of systematic racism that led to the death of George Floyd are the same underlying issues that have led to communities of color, especially our Black community, to be affected more by COVID-19 than the rest of the state. We have to continue to protect each other and ensure that all Minnesotans, particularly in communities of color and Indigenous communities, are healthy and safe. During times of grief and anger, our instinct is to run to each other, to come together and to hold one another. But the way that we love our communities most fully is to protect one another. Last night, we saw those choose to express their grief and their anger through protest wearing masks, distancing themselves from others as best they could. I thank the demonstrators for the measures and their commitment to safely protest during the pandemic at a time when nothing feels normal. As a light-skinned Native American woman, I am grappling with my own responsibility to push back against anti-Blackness in my own community and in the systems in which I work every day. This is the work. Someday, when it's safe, we will all have the option of going back to normal. But we must not let that happen. Normal, quote unquote, means that Black and brown bodies are not safe. Normal was not working for us. We cannot get back to normal. We must get back to better. The governor and I will continue to fight for answers and for justice for George Floyd, his family, and for Minnesota. Thank you.
Attorney General Ellison.
Governor, Lieutenant Governor, let me join you in just acknowledging that George Floyd was a man who was loved by some. He was a person who had every reason to look forward to his life. He was a person who worked and made a contribution to his community and his family. It was particularly touching to hear his employers talking about how much they loved him and what a contribution he made to their establishment. He was somebody, and his life mattered, and he was an important person to many. And the fact that he is gone and the way that he was taken is deeply tragic on multiple levels. Allow me to just say that the investigation has started, both state and federal. If you have information, we need you to come forward and share it. It is very important that the investigation is thorough, is fair, and is just. And I will say that I will be, and my office will be, a force for transparency, accountability, and justice. We will call it out when we see otherwise, and we will foster it every opportunity we get. This means that at this point, that this investigation must proceed with a degree of objectivity. We're not going to prejudge the facts, though the video is so clear before our eyes. Why? Because at the end of this process, we want nobody to be able to question the process. And whatever the consequences may be, they will be just, they will be fair, and they will be what the law requires. Let me say also that it is important to understand that this tragic event that took the life of George Floyd is a point in time and an incident involving a person. But the reason that there's so much outrage connected to it is because it is part of a larger pattern, as the Lieutenant Governor mentioned. We could talk about Jamar Clark or Philando Castile, but we can go all the way back to Rodney King. We can go back to my city that I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I remember very clearly as a 5-year-old, tanks rolling down the street because of the riots that were sparked by unfortunate incident between police and African-American community members. But my father would tell us, well, you don't remember, son, the 1943 riot. 68 riot wasn't the first one. There was others, all along similar patterns. And that's why when the Kerner Commission report came out in the 1960s after these civil disturbances, they said that the spark of all this was bad police-community relations. Now, bad housing, unemployment, and a whole range of other social problems really built the tension, but it was the incidents that occurred between the police and community that sparked it and caused tremendous problems. So what we're dealing with is not an isolated case. We're dealing with a systemic problem. And the investigation and the prosecution, if that happens, and the ultimate consequences, they are being handled. I'm confident that they're being handled competently. But that doesn't end it. The discharge of the officers doesn't end it. The criminal process that has begun doesn't end it. The civil rights process doesn't end it. We've got to have permanent, deep, systemic change, which is why myself and Commissioner Harrington, who you'll hear from in a moment, led an effort, the working group Police Involved Deadly Force Encounters, which we issued in February 2020. This report lays out a series of recommendations that we arrived at with our group, which included law enforcement, community, civil rights, people from diverse ethnic backgrounds, many people throughout the state. We went to Cloquet, we went to Bemidji, we went to St. Paul, we went all over the state to talk and to listen to people. And so I think it is a good time for us to understand that this report was always a working report, was always a report designed to solve a systemic problem. And I urge us to really reflect upon the recommendations in this report, because at some moment, sadly, George Floyd will be laid to rest. at some moment, the process, the criminal and civil rights process will be concluded. But will we have made any real substantive changes, or will we just be setting ourselves up for it to happen all over again? So I just want to say that the recommendations in this report are critical. I urge people to reflect and look on this so that we can begin to really make the changes that this state deserves. I will mention that under Pillar 4, policy and legal implications, 4.2 suggests that we adopt use of force standards that make sanctity of life a core organizational value and include requirements for de-escalation, reasonable, necessary, and proportionate use of force, duty to intervene, which means if you're an officer, you can't stand around and say, well, he did it. That wasn't me. And use of sound tactics and reporting unreasonable use of force. And so I just want to conclude here and just say deep sympathy to the family of George Floyd. I want to urge people who want to demonstrate to use proper protocols for safety. We are still in the middle of a pandemic, and it is important that you exercise your First Amendment rights safely, and I urge you to do so. So with that, I'll conclude here. I'll be available for questions, but Commissioner Harrington.
Good afternoon. I'm John Harrington, the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, and I want to echo this sentiments of sympathy to the family and friends and the Minneapolis community on the passing of George Floyd. I was alerted to this incident by the BCA. Superintendent Drew Evans called me to let me know that Minneapolis had what they believe might be an officer-involved death. Not an officer-involved shooting, but a death that was part of a police use of force. The BCA, as the state investigative agency, moved quickly to take over that crime scene and to begin the criminal investigation. As part of that process, they reached out to the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, Mike Freeman, and in particular to Amy Sweezy, who has been the lead prosecutor in the past cases with Hennepin County. They began the process of gathering information, working with the medical examiner, working with the Minneapolis Police Department, and in conversations with Chief Madero Arredondo, it was decided that a civil rights violation really did appear to be occurring on that screen, as that footage that has revolted so terribly many people. Chief Arredondo then contacted the FBI, and the new SAC, Special Agent in Charge, Rainier Droschlager, agreed to take on the case as a civil rights or a color of law investigation. And Superintendent Evans and SAC Droschlager are conducting this investigation as a joint investigation. They are doing a parallel investigation, but the impetus behind this has been that we will do an expeditious investigation. We will make sure that this is not an investigation that lags. But just as important as it being expeditious, because we know the public and the community and all of you want to know what happened that fateful day, it will be an investigation that's done right. This will not be an investigation where we're going to cut any corners, where we're going to miss any T's to be crossed or I's to be dotted. We are going to make sure that this investigation is done properly so that when we go to trial, if we go to trial, when we present this case to the Hennepin County Attorney's Office for prosecution, and when the FBI presents this case to the U.S. Attorney for prosecution, that all of the facts necessary for a charge will be there. One of the things that we need right now from the public is witnesses. And one of the things that the public can do right now to help expedite this investigation is to contact the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension And if you were there, or if you took video of what was there, if you know people that were there, we want to hear from you, because the sooner that we can get all of the witnesses and get their statements, the sooner we can move this case along. We do have to wait for certain factual pieces of the process. The medical examiner has not yet done an autopsy. We do not have results from that yet, and we will have to wait for that, because that is a crucial piece of information in any murder or death investigation. But we want to be able to do everything else that we have in our power to move this case along as quickly and as expeditiously as we possibly can. I want to thank Attorney General Ellison. He and I took a journey over the last year to Minnesota to try and discuss this, what would happen. We talked about this as being deadly force encounters. We talked about it, and people criticized us initially about the fact that it should have been just officer-involved shootings. And unfortunately, this is exactly the kind of scenario that we talked about as to why we talked about and why we brought the focus to being a deadly force encounter and not just an officer-involved shooting. This case reminds me so terribly of the Eric Garner case in New York. But I can promise you that unlike the Eric Garner case, which waited years for action, much as Chief Arredondo took swift action on the employment of the 4 Minneapolis officers, you will not have to wait. There will not be a lag in time for the investigation by the BCA to be presented to the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, and I expect that you can expect to see progress made regularly. The last piece that I will note, and I appreciate once again the Attorney General bringing up the work we've done on the working group, is there is so much pain in the community. The video from last night was just an example of that pain being expressed, the trauma being expressed. And one of those recommendations we talked about is, how do we heal community? We spent one entire session just talking about healing the wounds the community has when someone that they love, someone they treasure, someone that they value is ripped from them in a deadly force encounter. And so I will encourage all of us, state and county and local levels, to think about, how do we help our communities heal? How do we empower those in the community that can bring us together? And how do we patch over the wounds that George Floyd's passing has opened? At this time, I will turn this back over to Governor Tim Walz to continue the briefing.
I happen to have these 3 public servants. The words coming from the Lieutenant Governor and understanding the depth of this. Attorney General Ellison's work goes back decades. I witnessed it as a colleague in Congress, working on civil rights issues and ways to make our communities whole and safe, and then a privilege of having John Harrington in a long history of working in community and seeing law enforcement from many different sides. And I too want to express, back into my role as governor and statutory requirements, my responsibility over Department of Public Safety and the BCA is to echo what Commissioner Harrington said, is to ensure an accurate, fair, and expeditious process around the facts of this case. And I'd want to acknowledge, too, what I think each of them hit on. Watching any of the video of what happened to George Floyd, and then watching citizens come out last night, I, too, share that urge of just a primal scream of when you watch humanity get erased in front of you. It is almost inexplicable how you respond. I want to be incredibly careful that anything I say from this office does not jeopardize a fair journey towards justice. So while my personal emotions are real and I'll validate them, I also trust that our system of justice is predicated on exactly that, a fairness for everybody involved, a true look at all of the facts involved, and then the expectation that those facts will be acted upon to provide justice for everyone involved. So we will take questions on this, but I want to do just a quick brief update before we go to Jan Malcolm on this. I think most of you know we crossed that threshold in this country of 100,000 Americans have died now in the last 3 months. We in Minnesota are, I stood here about 3 weeks ago with you, and I said what's so frustrating and terrifying about this is, as long as we continued where we were at and kept the pace of where we were going at, I said I will stand in front of you on about the 28th or 29th of May, and we will have crossed 1,000. That was the day we had crossed 500. That pace is relatively stable, which is terrifying as is somewhat of good news. But what we're finding is a better understanding of COVID and the spread in our communities. I want to thank the Minnesota National Guard, and we'll continue to use them. We tested over 10,000 people at 6 locations on the weekend, a holiday weekend, and this was no barriers. Come in, there was no payment, there was no anything. You came in, you got it, and you got your results back. We're going to continue to do those types of things. We're going to continue to target the areas from congregate care living facilities to communities that are underserved in this, because once again, Lieutenant Governor was speaking truth in this, that COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting communities of color, and the Black community is showing up in that, both from a health perspective and from an economic perspective. We're also seeing in places across the country that an undertesting in those communities is leading to the lack of understanding how it's spreading. We can't allow it to happen in Minnesota. Finally, I signed an executive order today that outlines phase 2 of the Stay Safe Minnesota plan. As announced last Wednesday, the next phases in Stay Safe include a cautious strategic turn of the dial, outdoor dining at restaurants and bars to start June 1st, where the number of customers at any one time is limited, and for the physical distance of 6 feet can be maintained. Also, personal services like salons and barbershops can open June 1st at 25% capacity to ensure that the safety of both employees and customers inside. Campgrounds will be opening and organized youth sports programs will be operating without competitive games, but getting back in the rhythm. We're trying to strike that proper balance. There's nothing healthier than having folks, young kids involved in the summer with those types of activities. It's not just the physical and the mental health, it's the memories that make summer so great, and we're trying our best to strike that proper balance. Again, when people keep asking me what's the difference from one place to another, we've distilled it down. There's a lot of things, but the 3 things that Commissioner Malcolm and everyone across the country that are in this say, it's first, how close you are to another person, second, how long you're in close proximity to that person, and third, how predictable the setting is, coming, moving, going, yelling, whatever it might be. Those are things that you can, that the lens that we're looking through. Rising cases in Minnesota, although we're still, I think, at 16 days. Jan will update us on that, at doubling. Those areas of caution where we're at, we have 2 areas of the state where we're kind of in the yellow on ICU bed capacity, those types of things. But overall, we are maintaining. And again, we're getting, I think, as more data comes in, maybe being able to tell, is this a plateau or is it a calm before the storm? All of the modeling, both internally, externally, and from partners that we work with, seems to still show that the peak is still a ways off, but there is a degree of uncertainty that comes in that prediction, and how we're acting in terms of masks, in terms of social distancing, in terms of staying home if you're sick, that will have an impact on it. So with that, I will have Commissioner Malcolm give us a quick update, and then we will be open for questions on all the subjects. So, Commissioner.
Thank you, Governor. I'll be really brief today, and it is something to note that we're here talking about the daily COVID briefing, but in the context of a much larger picture of health in our community and what creates health and what threatens health. And I so appreciate the comments of Governor, Lieutenant Governor, our Attorney General, my colleague, Commissioner Harrington, about kind of drawing the connections between these issues and the fact that the conditions in our community that put some people at greater harm, at greater risk than others, is the challenge that we all face together. And as both the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor have just reiterated today, that does show up in our data about who's getting exposed to COVID, who's getting seriously ill, who's getting hospitalized. And as the Governor just pointed out, nationally, the lack of proportionate testing in the communities that are at greatest risk, I think, is clouding our picture nationally of where the risks are and where the interventions need to be concentrated. So I appreciate, though I'm very also heartsick about the context of today's discussion, and my sincere condolences as well. So as the governor mentioned, we crossed a major milestone during the day today of over 100,000 United States deaths, 1.7 million cases. Again, stunning speed of spread of COVID-19 across our country in just the last few months. Globally, 5.6 million cases and 350,000 deaths. Again, just a breathtaking speed of the impact of this pandemic around the globe. As the governor mentioned, yesterday we added an additional 500 laboratory-confirmed cases to our total, bringing Minnesota now to 22,464 cases. It was on a testing volume that for a Tuesday was quite high, over 6,600 tests, partly because of the community-based testing that the governor mentioned. And again, just deep, deep thanks to the National Guard and so many people in local public health and across state agencies that helped to make that happen. And thank you to the Minnesotans who came out, stood in long lines, and clearly expressed their desire for more access to testing. Sadly, we also are reporting an additional 33 deaths among Minnesotans, among our family and neighbors from COVID-19. That is that is tied for the daily high total of mortality, matching last Friday's total also of 33 deaths that day. 16 of these deaths were in Hennepin County, 6 in Dakota, 5 in Ramsey, 3 in Anoka, 1 each in Nicollet, Nobles, and Washington counties. The demographics: 2 people above the age of 100, 9 in their 90s, 11 in their 80s, 6 in their 70s, 4 in their 60s, and 1 person in their 30s without any known underlying health conditions at this point. There are 598 people currently in the hospital, 260 of those in intensive care units, which is the highest daily total to date. But as the governor has mentioned, and I've mentioned in prior days' briefings, all of the data indicators are mixed. We see relative stability in the growth pattern, a moderate rate of growth toward what we still expect to be the peak later in June or even into July. But we do see some more accelerating and concerning signs, like the rate of increase in ICU capacity, even though we have planned for this and have surge capacity available in the state. The fact that a couple of our hospitals have already gone into that surge space at this point in the curve is important to note and gives us reason to be really, really watching these data. And as the governor indicated, some of the dial-back criteria that we've talked about, the doubling time in terms of cases looks good. The healthcare capacity is kind of still within the range that we projected, but is yellow in some areas. But the rate of hospital admissions is particularly on a rolling average in the more recent time period is something that we're watching really closely. So with that, I will turn it back to the governor and be available for questions if you have any.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Malcolm. At this time, I think all of us would be, and I will make sure that the Attorney General and Commissioner Harrington are available for questions. So please go ahead to the press.
Governor, let me start to you and to the Attorney General. The Mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, has called for the one officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck to be charged criminally. Do you, Attorney General, do you, Governor, agree with that? Should he be charged?
I think, and I would answer to this, and I want to be, as I prefaced a little earlier, be very clear about the position I'm in to not either taint or influence how this comes out, because our justice system's pretty clear. We will get the evidence. We will present that. The charging authority is Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman. We spoke with him today to ensure and reassure him that we are doing everything we can in a professional, expeditious manner, and to reassure the public that that's going to happen. So I think that is the proper way to go. That is the thing in the position that I'm in that I will advocate for.
I'll just say that we have a normal course of criminal prosecution, which starts with a fact-based investigation and then an evaluation of whether criminal statutes democratically passed have been violated. And that is the procedure we should follow. I understand the emotions are running high, and I think it's important for the mayor to channel the emotion of the people who he represents. But I think it is critical that we adhere very closely to the facts and the law and the normal process. And so that's what I'm supporting, and that's what I believe we should do.
To both of you, protesters are back out at 38th in Chicago and at the 3rd Precinct right now. They have gathered for a second straight day. What is the state, if anything, doing to make sure that the unrest does not get to the point of last night?
Well, I think first of all, and you've seen me stand in front of here and say that I will do everything in my power to protect the people who are protesting against me or something that I have. I think this is a fundamental right they have. I think, as I said, that primal sense of outrage that folks are feeling, there's a sense in doing this. I would encourage them to do so with a mask, to socially distance. We certainly don't want to see things turn violent in any way, but I also think this is a pretty normal response where people are giving. And I think what we need to see is I saw folks out there from across the community with baby carriages and things expressing what all of us saw in a video. And I simply think that that's a proper way to approach this. And we will do everything we can to keep things as safe as possible. We want the normal business to be able to go on, but we certainly believe that there's a right that people have to gather.
I was specifically talking about the clash between police and protesters last night. Protesters were throwing rocks at police cars and at the 3rd Precinct.
Yeah,
police
certainly
were firing back with chemicals.
Yeah, we're not condoning that, and I would say we need to do everything we can to de-escalate that situation. I think if folks are given the chance to gather, at least, I mean, what I'm seeing on that is that they want to express in community their outrage. I don't think they're there to engage in the violence or to have that. And I think we need to be smart to make sure we don't set up situations that cause those clashes. Attorney General.
Yeah, what I will say is I would urge law enforcement to exercise restraint. Restraint is the better part of valor, they say. And you're dealing with people who are hurt, who have been through a lot, and this is not the first similar kind of incident, and they're outraged. So I would urge restraint. I also would urge protesters to remember that they are there to lift up the memory and get justice for Mr. Floyd. And so they should conduct themselves in a way that will enhance that and not distract attention away from what happened to Mr. Floyd, but would keep the attention focused on what happened to Mr. Floyd. And, letting your emotions override in a way that would cause the conversation to shift to, crowd behavior isn't a wise way to handle this. And it certainly is not a way to make sure that Mr. Floyd remains central. And so that would be my recommendation.
Dana?
Commissioner Malcolm, can you talk a little bit about surrounding these?
We've been watching a live press conference from St. Paul with Governor Tim Walz and other Minnesota leaders. We're used to seeing these COVID-19 update press conferences, but today it was really overshadowed by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Both the governor and lieutenant governor expressed horror at a perceived lack of humanity in the video of that incident. You heard that the thorough investigation has begun. We also heard from Attorney General Keith Ellison, who emphasized the need for systemic change here. We are looking into police policies here in the Northland and also attending a rally for George Floyd that's about to begin here in Duluth. We'll have those stories on WDIO News at 5, 6, and 10. See you then.
This has been a WDIO News special report.